Hi, thank you for joining me in the Louie file again. Today we are still in Colossians chapter 3, but hopefully we're going to move right along toward the end of that chapter today. We're going to start in verse 20, Colossians 3:20. Last video we talked about wives and husbands. Today we're going to start off with the children here. Colossians 3:20 says, "Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well pleasing to the Lord." That's pretty straightforward. In fact, there is a commandment. One of the 10 commandments says, honor your father and mother. And by this, that I'm probably misquoting this, but you will live long in the earth. So obedience to parents is where it all starts. If we're not obedient to our parents, then we're going to probably be out of order in most of our lives. I had a pastor for a lot of years, and he said it this way. He said, if children aren't disciplined by their parents, in other words, if parents, if the child isn't in order, should I say, with their parents, under obedience to them, then they're going to find themselves in a lot of trouble. So children have to be disciplined, and they need to be willing to take it. So in other words, put it this way. If children aren't obedient to parents, they won't be obedient to the police officers in their community. They'll have disrespect and rebellion against judges and authorities of every kind, more than likely. So it all starts at home. If a child is disciplined by his parents, he won't have to be disciplined by the government. But if he isn't, then the prisons and the jail systems, the reformatories, and the rehabs are all full of people that are going to get that discipline in another way. That's not to say that every single person in rehab was not obedient to their parents. I hope you're understanding me. I'm making blanket statements here, but the point being is it all starts at home. So children, get obedient to your parents and you'll live long in this earth. It's well pleasing to the Lord. Colossians 3:21, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart." I think, by and large, mothers are more merciful and patient a lot of times than the father. Fathers get a little agitated when the child takes too long to do what they're saying. I mean, from a father's perspective, they're thinking, I told you what to do, why aren't you doing it? A mom is a little more understanding normally. Now these roles could be reversed at any time, but so he's giving the fathers a little warning here. He's saying don't be so demanding on your children that they give up hope, that they see that what you're expecting is just impossible. That I just can't do it, and I'm just going to give up. This push for immediate obedience and perfect behavior all the time can be a little bit damaging to children if we're not careful, and they'll lose heart. Colossians 3:22, "Slaves, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality." Now this is over time, I think this has been a real contentious issue here. This translation, Colossians 3:22, says slaves. Some translations say servants. But I think slaves is probably a more accurate term here. All right, so let's think about this. The Bible is not okay with a person having another person as a slave in terms of dominating over them and mistreating them. I don't think God promotes that at all. In fact, I think God's plan has always been that He will be over us and not any man. If you look back in the story of Israel, they longed to have a king over them like the other nations. Well, God's plan was that Israel would be a holy nation, a nation of priests. And the plan is that they would know this one true God, and that they would all be one under Him as the head, and that the rest of the world would look to Israel and say, how are they doing that? They don't have a government like ours at all. Their system is totally not like ours. How are they getting along? How are they prosperous and healthy and productive and loving like they are? That's God's plan. So when they were clamoring for a king over them, God says, okay, well, I'm going to give you what you want, but you're not going to like it, because this king is going to take your young men and daughters, and he's going to put them in service to him. And he's going to use your land as his own, and you're just really not going to like it, but I'm going to give you what you want. So even in the sense of a king and subjects under him, that was not really God's ultimate idea. That was what man seemed to have wanted at the time, and He gave them that. But eventually, of course, we have to cry out, and then we become subject to the one real head, who is Christ. But as far as the slave thing goes, I don't think Paul is promoting it, but I think he's saying wherever you find yourself, wherever you are in life, if you're a slave and you're reading this letter, just as a child or a wife or a husband, as each of us are subject to the one above us, you are the same way. Now, I don't think he's saying that if you're a slave, you should be okay with it and just settle into being a slave and never seek to get freed. But what he is saying is you serve your master as to the Lord, just like a child obeys his parents, or a wife is subject to the husband, and the husband is subject to Christ. We all fit in this order of command. So he's saying, don't just do this in an outward way just to be a man pleaser, but do it from inside, from sincere heart and fearing the Lord. So and this applies to all of us. You know what? We're all, Romans 6 says we all start out as a slave to sin, and then when we come to Christ, we become a slave to righteousness. So there is a sense that all of us are slaves or servants of another all the time. So that part's really not in question in a way. What's really in question is which master are you a slave to? Bob Dylan got it right. He said we're all going to have to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but we're all going to have to serve somebody. And Paul's advice or point here is he's saying whatever you do, just do it with all you have, but do it for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord is where your inheritance and your reward is going to come from. And it's really the Lord, it's really Christ that you're serving. In verse 25 it says, he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong. So we have to trust God to deal with whoever might be over us in this moment, whether it's our boss or the husband, a parent, a governing authority, a ruler, a judge, a governor, a president. Ultimately, we're trusting God that He knows what He's doing with these people in these positions over us. So we don't get too hung up and caught up in the earthly representative, but we see through to the invisible God who is really in charge after all, right? It's an interesting thing as we finish up this letter to the Colossians. He mentions, he names some people in chapter 4, which I kind of want to jump ahead just for a second here to make this point because we're talking about slaves. He brings up in Colossians 4:9, it says, and with him Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of your number. They will inform you about the whole situation here. So Paul wrote this letter and he mentions some people, and one of them is Onesimus. Now, for a Bible student, that may sound familiar to you, and it should. It's a little bit of an obscure little letter because it's one chapter, and I don't hear much about it. But if you want to read about this person, Onesimus, you can see it in Philemon. It's one chapter, 25 verses, and I'll give you a quick summary here. The Apostle Paul wrote this little letter, Philemon, to a man named Philemon, and part of what this subject is about here is a slave named Onesimus. Somehow we piece together that it seems that Onesimus had disobeyed or ran away from Philemon, and he found himself either locked up or somehow visiting the Apostle Paul in prison. And the Apostle Paul led him to the Lord. So Onesimus became born again. And if you look in Colossians 4:9, he calls him a beloved brother. And if you read the Philemon letter, Paul is sending Onesimus back to Philemon because Philemon is Onesimus' master. Onesimus is a runaway slave, and he's sending him back to Philemon. But look with me here. Philemon 1 verse 10, Paul says this to Philemon. He says, I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my imprisonment, who formerly was useless to you, but now is useful both to you and to me. I have sent him back to you in person, that is sending my very heart, whom I wish to keep with me, so that on your behalf he might minister to me in my imprisonment for the gospel. But without your consent I did not want to do anything, so that your goodness would not be in effect by compulsion, but of your own free will. For perhaps he was for this reason separated from you for a while, that you would have him back forever. Now here we go, listen to this. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So Paul is saying, Onesimus ran away from you as a slave, but I'm sending him back to you as a brother. Isn't that great? Philemon 1:17, if then you regard me a partner, accept him as you would me. But if he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge that to my account. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will repay it, not to mention to you that you owe to me even your own self as well. Yes, brother, let me benefit from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Christ. So it seems Philemon must have been led to the Lord by Paul also. It's so great. So Paul is saying, look, I'm sending Onesimus back to you as a brother. He's no longer, in a sense, your slave, but he doesn't tell Philemon to free him, really. But he is hinting at the idea that if he's a brother now, you still might be in a position of authority over him, master to slave in this sense. So he's not really even addressing that, but he is saying, receive him as a brother. Now that changes the relation between the two people, and it would with all of us. In fact, I got a quick little personal story to tell you here that I think relates to this, that I was a part of and got to witness. I have two men I know. Now they're older than I am, and they one of them was he grew up on the street more or less, drugs, violence, theft, all of those things. He found himself in and out of jail. He ended up getting caught up in a murder case. He went to prison. He got out. He did not, I don't know all the details here, but he broke his parole. They put him back in. He ended up doing 14 years total, I think it was. Well, while he was growing up in this lawlessness, there was a police officer here in my own hometown, and they had several run-ins. Now, and my understanding is, some folks would even say the police officer wasn't such a great guy, but he was in a position of authority over this other guy. I mean, he was a police officer. Okay, so these two men had known each other on the streets on opposing sides of the equation. The police officer, not really a great guy, but he was an authority. The other guy, I don't know, maybe he wasn't such a great guy at the time. But that's really not the point I'm trying to make here. There is a authority structure here. All right, so the man goes to prison. He gets out. Now, at this time, he's born again. He's been transformed. I'm going to church with him. In fact, both of these men are going to the same church. And there came a point in time where the man that had done the time in prison was going to be ordained as a minister. So he and his wife were sitting up front. He was in a chair. His wife was behind him. And some of the deacons of our church went up to pray over him and, in fact, wash his feet. And guess what? The one that had been the police officer was a deacon. And I got to see with my own eyes, he bent down in front of this man that had spent all this time in prison, that was now being ordained, and he washed his feet. So the police officer who was in authority over this rebellious guy years before, both of them had been transformed by the power of Christ, and he washed his feet. Now, I would ask you, can anyone but God do such a thing? So when that took place, I saw very clearly that these two were, it wasn't about one being in power over the other at all. It was about brotherhood in Christ. It was about, we are co-heirs with Christ. We are one with Him. No matter what authority we have or authority we're under in this life, we are to live unto Christ. And we are to operate according to Him and for Him. And that's what I think Paul is saying here ultimately. And if we find ourselves under the tyranny of a boss or a master that we don't like, we have to remember Colossians 3:25. Paul says, "He who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality." From God's perspective, it's not that He doesn't understand the hierarchy, but from God's perspective, He's one-on-one with each man's heart. And whatever position you are in, high or low, He will be the one to promote or demote, bless or not, or I mean, He's in charge of all that. It's God who lifts up people into authority. We may or may not agree with their behavior. You know, in the Old Testament, God raised up kings that were great and they led people in righteousness, and then all of a sudden there was many kings that did evil, did a lot of bad things, got involved in idol worship and sinful things. But even so, I have to believe that God, it wasn't a mistake, and that God, they didn't get by God in terms of, oh no, how did he become king? God has a plan. He has a sovereign idea and understanding of how things go, and sometimes I think He raises up what we might call bad or evil rulers because we need discipline, and that's just a form that He does this through. It's just all wrapped up in His sovereignty. So in chapter 4 of Colossians, he moves on in the same thought. In verse 1, he says, "Masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven." So he's touching on it, all walks of life: husbands and wives, fathers and children, mothers, bosses and workers, co-workers, slaves and masters, all of it. This is how we walk this thing out as being this new creature we are in Christ, is we have to relate and interconnect and interrelate with other people all the time. So the Christ that is now in us, this new creature that we are in our inner man, has to manifest on the outside. So the way we take abuse or mistreatment sometimes, that's how we display Christ. It isn't all just wonderful all the time to our flesh. Sometimes we're called to suffer for doing what is right. Sometimes we obey the ones over us, knowing that God knows what He's doing, and we just let Him produce the results, and we don't have to understand it all the time. All right, I'm not going to ramble anymore. I hope this has helped you today. And I would hope that you would join me in the very next installment of the Louie File, where we move on into the Colossians, the last chapter of Colossians, chapter 4. And we're going to push on through verse by verse as we always do. And thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you the next time.